we have 5 discussants, and you have can respond to the speaker's idea and also introduce your work. So the first one will be Gustave Machis, and he is he is an engineer and economist, and he was a former professor at the Architecture School of Paris La Villette, and now he is a member of the core member of the Scientific Council of the Attac. Please, Gustave.
Hello, Kinshi and Jade. Good evening to all of you. I am very honored to be with you and to participate to this very important event. My contribution will focus on transition and crisis of civilization in the time of pandemic and climate crisis. Today, we are facing a conjunction of a major climate crisis and a pandemic crisis that accompanies the Anthropocene. This crisis concerns the civilization carried by capitalism and capitalist globalization, at least in its neoliberal phase and probably in the foundations of capitalism itself. Ecological contradiction question the relationship between the human being and nature. Economic and social contradiction question the dominant system, namely neoliberal capitalism. Political contradiction question institutions, states, and democracy. Ideological and cultural contradiction question world understanding. Geopolitical contradiction question the international system. The debates are open on all these aspects. The overall corresponds to a crisis of civilization. Transitions are long and uncertain periods. Samir Amin had emphasized the importance of transitions between modes of production. He also questioned the linearity of history, which would have seen the succession of modes of production of primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, to reach the expected end, that of socialism and communism. He had shown the bias of this Western-centric vision and insisted on the neglected modes of production, such as the lineage mode of production important in Africa and Asia, and as the Asian or central tributary modes of production, that of the great empires that played a major role in history. I would also like to underline the idea developed by Samir Amin that the transition is being prepared in the peripheries, where the balance of power is less fixed, where the new can make its way, where the imagination of dominated are the excluded, and the excluded can discover the vulnerabilities of the dominants. The discussion on ecological, social, democratic, and geopolitical transition has the interest of naming the great contradictions at work. Now it remains to nourish each of these dimensions with new proposals for the construction of another possible and necessary world. It is also necessary to develop the alternatives, the new social relations of surpassing capitalism in today's societies. The question of democracy is at the beginning of certain paths of transition. Democracy in corporations, local democracy, democracy in public action and in state institutions, international democracy. Similarly, the situation is based on inequalities between countries and peoples, which are unbearable and are becoming less and less supported. Democracies have to be reinvented. The situation revealed by the pandemic also leads us to reflect on historical rupture and continuities. The hypothesis of discontinuities cannot be ignored. The ecological rupture leads us to reflect on the implication of the crisis of civilization, taking the scale of the resulting shocks. A crisis of civilization leads to upheavals that some may describe as collapse, which characterize processes and does not signify falling into millenarist fears. What some now call the collapse is also the preparation of new civilization. It is not the end of the world, it is the beginning of a long transition that will not be linear. The way the world has reached to COVID-19 has demonstrated the significance of the shocks that are taking place. The COVID-19 health crisis demonstrated the weakness of the United States as the dominant pole and the weakness of the organization of the international system in its inability to respond to global crises. The fall of the American empire is an open assumption. The Western system is still militarily dominant, but has lost the ability to think globally. This capacity seems to have been displaced to Asia. It should be pointed out that this shift toward the Pacific is not in itself a civilizational advance, a new model, but a new geopolitical balance, leaving more room for multipolarity. The health crisis has also demonstrated the inadequacy of the international system. Responses to a global crisis have been national, without much consultation. The possibility of multipolarity is open. And today, in the current situation, the contradiction will be exacerbated. The ruling classes are still there, and they will do everything they can to regain control. They will implement the shock strategy described by Naomi Klein. The first task of the movements will be to resist xenophobic, racist, and securitarian ideologies. Resist the questioning of individual and collective freedom. Resist economic and social blackmail, unemployment, and misery. Resist wars and the police and military build-up. This resistance will create contradiction and opportunities. Social contradiction with the exacerbation of inequalities. Internal contradiction within capitalism, between extractivist capitalism and GAFAM capitalism. Social contradiction between the mass of executives and shareholders. Ecological contradiction with the awareness of living conditions on the planet, climate, biodiversity, pandemics. Demographic contradiction with high schooling and unemployed graduates. Population aging and migration. Geopolitical contradiction with the rise of the global south and the decline of the resilience of American and European empires. The second task of the movement is to work on alternatives and to start building a new world in the ancient world. The combination of the climate crisis and the pandemic crisis is challenging certainties. The religion of capitalist development no longer makes sense. It carries a philosophical crisis. The battle of cultural hegemony, as defined by Gramsci, has begun. It will be hard, but it is not lost. Against the ideology of neoliberal capitalist globalization and inequalities, what is being promoted are rights and equality of rights. Rights against profits, rights to health, to education, to housing, to income and work, rights and obligations for nature and the living environment. We promote women's rights, the rejection of discrimination, racism, and the rejection of police violence. It is a new global movement that articulated classes, genders, and origin. It is an awareness of the persistent traces of slavery and colonization. These ideas have progressed, and the climate and the pandemic crisis have confirmed their evidence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gustave. And the second discussant is Ashish KOTHARI, and he is the he found the new global network. It's called the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, and he is a researcher, activist, and he author on environment development interface, biodiversity policy, globalization and development alternatives. Please.
Tsui and Kinchi and others for this opportunity. And it's been actually very inspiring to hear the speakers and Gustave, my fellow respondent. There is actually very little to disagree with what the speakers have said. But what I would like to do is to add some dimensions, especially to try and add what I think is a global South perspective. Because one of the things, like I've said in the chat, that happens is that in the South, we tend to look at what's happening in the West and copy it or emulate it without, kind of blindly. We did that with development, so to speak, and now we're doing that with Green New Deal and degrowth and so on, without actually looking at our own roots and seeing what are the kinds of transformative worldviews that we already have and that can emerge from our own roots in dialogue, of course, with what's happening in the North and the rest of the world. So with that, I would like to share some slides if I can. Let me see if I'm able to do that. Can you see the slides? So Tsui, can you?
Yes, we can see that. Yeah. Please.
All right. So very happy to have heard Jayati talking about multiple colors. Nice coincidence, because I was also thinking that it's not just about a Green New Deal, but many, many different colors. And so maybe to start talking about a rainbow transformation that we need for creating justice, equity, sustainability, and so on. Just to spend a minute on this, I don't think this needs, for this set of people, it doesn't need to be elaborated at all, how a certain form of development, especially in the last 60, 70 years, has actually been a form of violence, whether it's violence against nature or communities or cultures. And economic growth has actually become a cancer for the earth. But also how this is, in some senses, a violence against each one of us individually in our own psychological, spiritual selves. And this whole transition in a certain westernized modernity from integral livelihoods to what I call deadlihoods, where we are destroying enormous amounts of, or marginalizing enormous numbers of people, and also creating jobs in the modern sector which are soul deadening, which are boring, which are mechanical, etc. And it's this multiple challenge that we have to be able to face. And it's a challenge that is especially exacerbated in the COVID times, as previous speakers have also said. We can, there's very, in a black and white way, there are two directions we can head. One is what governments and corporations are doing, more authoritarianism, more state surveillance, more profit making and so on, or what is emerging also from solidarity movements and radical movements around the world, a transition towards a more just, equitable and sustainable society. And I think it's an incredible crossroads that we are at right now. To me, this transformation, if we want to move into that second direction, is a combination of two things. Continued strong bottom-up people's resistance to various forms of oppression and repression and unsustainability, including many that Rebecca and Jayati and Mithika have spoken about. And in a sense, these resistances are very much part of the alternative, because they provide us different worldviews, different cosmovisions of what our relation is with the rest of the earth, or what our relations are with each other, but also they help to slow down the bulldozer, the juggernaut of destructive development in many different parts of the world, including the two images I've just shown you of people fighting against mega hydroelectricity projects in central India. But along with that resistance, we also need the construction or the reconstruction of people-led alternatives for meeting basic needs, for meeting aspirations, for removing deprivation, hunger, poverty, inequality of various kinds, injustices of various kinds. And we have thousands of them in India, and of course tens of thousands across the world. Obviously, we don't have the time to go into all of these, but I'll point to a recent book that we've just published, in which there are about 100 examples from around the world of these kind of radical, people-centered alternatives, which are also very much centered on an ecological worldview, on a feminist worldview, on worldviews that lead towards justice. To my mind, something that's emerging from our context in South Asia is what could be called eco-Swaraj. The notion of Swaraj has not yet become popular around the world, unlike, say, buen vivir and tea growth and so on. But I think it's a very important one coming from our own ancient civilizations here, which essentially is about living autonomously with full freedom as an individual and a community, but in responsibility to your freedom and your autonomy, etc. So there's a rights and responsibilities, and it also then is talking about living responsibly with the rest of the earth. So it's a very simple concept. How do each one of us actually become decision makers? We don't leave it to politicians and bureaucrats, but as we take decisions wherever we are and whatever collectives we are actually being also ecologically responsible and socially responsible. Similar concepts are there around the world, and I think this is really, really important to be able to also challenge the hegemony of the new alternatives emerging from the West, whether it's degrowth or it's Green New Deal. Not that I have fundamental disagreements with them, there are some disagreements, but to say that we have our own, whether it's the ones coming from ancient civilizations, indigenous peoples from Latin America and Southern Africa and so on, or it's new ones also emerging from, in some senses, the belly of the beast. And that, of course, also then includes the Green New Deals, as long as what's coming from anywhere is respectful of the diversity of such worldviews and such new ideas and practices that are emerging. And that what we try and do is to actually find some synergies amongst them. And this is where I'd like to share this, what we call a flower of transformation. So if we're looking at, say, 5 spheres of life: politics, economics, society, culture, knowledge, and ecology, the kind of transformations that we're seeing with these alternative movements or resistance movements is, first of all, with politics, no longer accepting the neoliberal form of democracy, but to say that democracy really is about power of the people, by the people, not power of the politicians that we elect. And so democracy is really about radical decision-making at the grassroots level, and then building from that to larger levels of decision-making, scales of decision-making, which actually then also leads us to challenge the notion of the nation state itself. Especially in continents like Asia and Africa, you can see that the nation state boundaries are accidents of colonial history, and we have to be able to challenge them if we also want to include ecological and cultural perspectives into it. The second important sphere is that of economic democracy, of producers actually being in control of their means of production, of dismantling capitalism, but also dismantling the enormous power of the state, even as we try and make the government accountable to various things, to dismantle their power over us in terms of the economic, in terms of basic needs, much more open localization. For instance, instead of economic globalization, and much more of a respect to the economy of caring and sharing, which in particular, for instance, recognizing the role of women, and of course the importance of the commons versus the private. The third important sphere is social justice, because both radical democracy and economic democracy will fail in localized situations, especially if we do not tackle issues of gender injustice in the Indian context, caste injustice, or other forms of discrimination and oppression that we have had either for many hundreds of years or thousands of years, or the new ones emerging in the modernist society. The fourth crucial sphere here is cultural knowledge diversity. Virtually all the radical alternative movements that I know of in the world are actually based on building on traditional value systems, traditional cultural values, and so on, but also including what's emerging from different parts of the world. So like Gandhi, for instance, said, the windows and the doors of my house are open to the winds of all cultures to blow through, but I refuse to be blown off my feet by any of them, which means I'm rooted in my own ecologies, my own cultures, my own knowledge systems, but I'm also learning from and open to dialogue with all the others. And it's this diversity that we have, and the commons of knowledge that we have to celebrate. And finally, of course, the fifth sphere, which one can think of as cross-cutting, as the basis for everything, which is maintaining the resilience and the sustainability of the earth itself. But at the core of this flower, and to my mind, that's the most important thing, is a sense of ethics, is a set of values and principles. And I think this is what could connect the different resistance and alternative movements around the world. It's not that we can replicate a Zapatista in India or replicate a Kurdish Rojava movement somewhere else, etc., in the same way. But we can learn the lessons from them. We can learn what are the values emerging from these radical movements, and then see, okay, how do they apply in our own context? So I've just put this up. Obviously, we don't have the time to go into these in any detail. But to my mind, this is a very, very important set of ethics that's very, very different, completely different from the dominant worldviews that are being imposed on us today, which have created the kind of global crises that we're in. Just a couple of minutes more. So how do we move from where we are now to, let's say, this kind of an ideal situation, or some kind of a utopian situation? Obviously, we're never going to fully reach there, but at least get in that direction. And I think what's really crucial is this combination of resistance to all the forms of domination and inequality and so on, and the active seeking for and practicing of alternatives on the ground. It's the combination of it's the ability for the marginalized to lead the way, and I'm glad, I think all the speakers have emphasized this right in the beginning, with critical support from people like us who are currently, let's say, privileged, even to be on this webinar, for instance. We obviously have our privileges, but to be out there in support of to those who are in the forefront of the movements. I think Jayati mentioned this. Of course, working for systemic transformation, but also trying to create the spaces, even as we are there right now, making governments more accountable, etc. So transformation plus transition. The combination of very localized action, Rebecca spoke about that, looking at what's actually happening globally also, so that we micro to macro is combined. In fact, some of these are binaries that also need to be demolished. And finally, and I think this is very important, that even as we're sort of struggling out there in the streets or wherever we are and doing our practical alternatives, we are also visioning the larger transformations. We're visioning the future society, and we're daydreaming also, and then trying to see, okay, how do we get to those dreams? So an attempt that we're trying to make to try and bring a lot of these movements together, to bridge them, to think about cross-cultural exchanges, to think about more collaboration, to think about more collective visioning, is what's called the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. Began last year. It's an attempt at a very horizontal, non-hierarchical way of putting things together. And we hope that this can be a contribution towards a more global movement. Thank you. Thanks a lot for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Ashish, for your...
Can I just make one last comment,
yes,
which is kind of a response also to the speakers, and I think could be part of the discussion, which is, or I should stop sharing, which is that I think, and this is the reason why I asked for the change of title from climate justice to environmental or ecological justice, because I think so much has, I mean, of course, climate is a massive, probably the biggest crisis we have, but it has hidden a lot of other ongoing and sometimes previous crises: the biodiversity crisis, the pollution crisis, the So if we think of everything in the form of carbon, which is unfortunately how the climate debate has often got portrayed, and I know the climate justice movement is trying to move away from that, I think it's very important for us to continue remembering that there's multiple ecological crises, multiple social economic crises, and that climate plays into them, is affected by them, but cannot become the only thing that we focus on. Thank you.
The next discussion, and Prita Pavaranji, she is a professor from Singapore University of Social Science, and she is also senior researcher fellow at the Asia Research Institute, National University of Singapore, and she received her PhD in sociology from Loyola University, Chicago, where she was also a Fulbright scholar for her MA studies. Her research interests span the sociology of architect, participatory urban development, social movement, and also public space. Rita, please.
I've been enjoying the discussion very much so far, and I feel very privileged actually to be in this panel. You know, I think, you know, I don't have any slides. I think I'll just sort of like continue the discussion from what the others have been saying. And being a sociologist with an architecture background, I think, you know, I want to just add a little more to the discussion, especially when I started thinking about this hegemony that both Gustave and Ashish has mentioned about how we actually think about the developments that are going around us that has caused a lot of these problems in the environment and in our society. And being a sociologist who have also observed social movements in Indonesia, I'm actually wondering about all these challenges that have been around for a long time. That, you know, I've seen actually a lot of progressive activists, not just in Indonesia, but also around the world, already calling for alternatives for quite some time. And there has also been some local examples and efforts for alternatives. There has also been successes in various levels. But at the same time, what are actually the difficulties to spread this around? And I think this is sort of like in response to one of the questions that Tsui sent to us earlier about like what are the weaknesses of these the strength and the weaknesses of the left or progressive intellectuals and our social movements. And you know, like I say in our email discussion before this, I've been thinking about this sort of like this hegemony that is very that seems to be quite difficult to break down. I think I don't want to be too pessimistic here, because I think, you know, it doesn't mean that it's not possible, but I just think that to address and to challenge this hegemony, what do we need to do? And I've been observing also that there's one element that is important to address here, which is the space component. And I will explain to you later on. But for sure, when I saw like the list from Ashish about, you know, the existing models of societies or alternatives that we can take a look at, you know, all of these actually requires some kind of space in which these societies can actually function relatively autonomously from this global capitalism, so that there's this space for communities to act and to do their actions collectively, so that there can be change, even if it's just on a local level. However, we also know that we continuously, as we all always have to live with our our own sort of like bodily experience, right? And all these experience actually require space. And the space in which we are living in, we continuously have to share this space with you know, this space, both social space and environmental spaces, with the spaces that are actually eaten up by this global capitalism, which also increasingly requires space. That's why we keep seeing all these indigenous communities being pushed out, for example, in terms of getting their natural resources. You know, we see mining corporations taking away forests of the indigenous people to actually feed into the global capitalism. So it is actually predatory, and it has like these spatial consequences. And the spaces that we occupy really affect our everyday life, and it also affects how we think about what is possible. And the spaces that we are living in right now are really increasingly produced as in a capitalist economy, which is, again, is a capitalist production of space. And space actually, in terms of this built environment, is actually one of those manifestations of capitalism, and it's all around us, including the homes we are living in, and as well as even these technologies that we are using is also one of these manifestations of global capitalism. So it does, capitalism in a way, it affects our everyday lives, both directly and indirectly. And I think as intellectuals and activists who are actually using this space, there is this kind of awareness as well. I'm not saying that we are not aware of this. I'm very sure we are very much aware of this. But what I'm saying is that, again, we are all in this very privileged space in which we sort of like have the time to also develop our critical thinking about how things operate. So this kind of hegemonic kind of influence that really seep into everybody's everyday life is really sort of like are affecting not just us, but also the societies around us. So I think environmental movements for ecological justice really should address the spatial inequality or unequal access to space. And otherwise, it is actually very difficult to think about social transformation. And given that it is very much in many places, this kind of expansion of global capitalism, just to think about space, right? That increasingly it is space is thought as really private property, and that is very much a serious challenge to have this social transformation to be able to be practiced. Now, I will just share with you some experiences that I have, why I actually arrived to, why I think this issue of hegemony and control of space and how space is being produced is really feeding in to the domination of global capitalism. I mean, living in Singapore right now, I mean, I'm from Indonesia. So, and then I went to the US to get my graduate degree. And then I came to Singapore for my academic job. And then now I'm actually encountering students in Singapore. And these are, I mean, Singapore, as you know, is an urbanized area, and it's very much embedded in global capitalism. And so, but it doesn't mean that, environmental movements are not around in here. Actually, environmental movement is quite popular. Yes, it is popular, especially among the youth, among my students. I mean, they're really interested in this, right? But again, they're interested, but not really deep enough to challenge capitalism in general. So probably more like the Green New Deal type of thing. They are very much fascinated by this, but it's very difficult to think about them critically. And so when I bring them to Indonesia, for example, for some field trips, and it's quite difficult to actually connect that with this issue of spatial justice, environmental justice, because of this kind of frame to think about, okay, we are thinking about environmental sustainability, and the green stuff is good, and we need to help these people who are actually in place. So it's not really thinking about transforming the society, but it's more about let's help these people. So the students that I have right now, I mean, they are all they're good students, they're kind-hearted, but again, this kind of the hegemony of this global capitalism, right? It really entraps them to think about all these kind-heartedness to just be about charity-based thing that thinks about this environmental stuff is more of this. Again, just to fit into this global capitalism rather than to challenge it. And so, again, to go back to this, I think, when we think about social transformation that is necessary to challenge this hegemony, it's really not only about social relations or hierarchy. Again, all of those are important, but also how these would manifest in, again, of course, economic systems, but also how they would manifest in space, how we distribute space, and how we decide on this distribution of space among different communities. And the notion of spatial justice here is also fitting into this to this matter. How the access to space, how affordability of spaces are actually very important in thinking about how we want to propose alternatives. So we've also seen, for example, this importance of space. Why this is sort of like the Achilles heel, I think, in terms of this whole thinking about this ecological justice movement. Is just that because when we are all have to share this space with global capitalism, once a crisis like this happened, right? This kind of pandemic happened. Actually, this kind of pandemic is a crisis for both global capitalism and for environmental movements. However, because of the hegemony here of the model of development, this kind of global capitalism type of practices and spaces are the ones that are getting all the bailouts. They're getting all the subsidies that are necessary to go back to normal. And so that's why there's this whole push of reopening. But what is happening with the environmental and social justice movements is that there are more limitations to space, right? There are all these restrictions to social gatherings. There are all these restrictions to social protests. And so I think it's very important for us to think about how this access to space plays out in this whole arena of ecological justice and pursuing social transformation. Okay, I think I'll stop there because I know that we are limited with time, but I'm very happy to continue with the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rita. And Professor Zhou Li can join us again. And so, Zhou 老师, yeah, please.
Thanks to Tsui. Yes, I'm offline and I'm back again. So, I just talk about, I learned a lot, heard a global voice from everywhere. And in China, we now, its survival is a very important thing. And the survival, yeah, we is everything, and the ecological give way to production and life to face the COVID-19. And I think things is happened in other world also. Next, please.
Yeah. This one, please.
Okay, I may talk about the climate change and how to adjust the three antennas. So this is my my thinking. These few months, we know the teletubles from Britain, and the child have their antennas, and we think every person have 3 antennas, and the first one is antennas for ourselves. The next one, please. And because we have the antenna inward, because every people have free will, have sensitivity, have reason, have spirituality. The antenna, which is inward, should constantly debug and keenly catch its own capture and regional and spatial changes, just like a very sensitive radio. So only when the band is accurate can it sensitive perceived and accurately expressed. Next, thanks. So we need regulate in time. So this is a antenna for everyone, for every people inward. And the second is the outward antenna. The outward is the relationship with other people and with the world. It's like boom rangers. What you threw out and will come back again. Therefore, we should be good to others, not to enemy to others. We have 2 golden rules of interpersonal relationship. It's high EQ ways. One is love others, love your neighbors as yourself, love others as much as you love yourself. It's a Chinese saying, do not do to others what you don't want. And higher than it is to do to others what you want. This is the first golden rules. And the second golden rules is to give in to what it likes. Treat them as they like. The master serves the servants, and the strong pity the weak is a desire of mine to impose on him. So this is 2 antennas. It's everybody have to face, and the problem is the third. Next one, please. Next slide. The third one is antenna upward. The upward is a spiritual one among the accessible peoples. We often see the mind is vast, like the Mama Earth, and in Chinese we call it Papa Heaven, or a Heavenly Father. Now it's true that the path of the spiritual is vast. They cannot only seek profits and avoid disasters, and also choose the road to eternity wisely. Compare with the inward and outward antennas, the upward antenna is, in Chinese we call it Shen Tong, and has the primary position compared with the other communications. The benefits of being able to transcend the present body and practicing our body and keeping our capital and is cognitive misunderstanding of self deception. We have common sense to tell us no matter how much you beauty, how much to exercise, how much time and energy are spent on maintenance and care, the skin and bite of our body will decay in decades and return to dust finally. And now we have no way to return to dust, and we burned to ashes. So we know we should improve IQ and EQ, and also SQ to focusing not only on human sensitivity and originality, and also spirituality. So with the three antenna, we can know what to do and how to face the COVID-19, how to face the climate change. And I am inspired from the Star of David of Israel. So I talk about the three antennas. Next slide, please. So how to adjust the three antennas? We in the climate change view, we need to adjust the three antennas, like the COVID-19, climate change, and justice. We should ask, where is the COVID-19 come from? It's from China, it's from Wuhan, or from other place? Where is the climate come from? Where is the justice come from? If we ask these questions, we may look upward, and we may not just blame others, like the outwards antennas, blame other nations, other countries, other groups. And we always, like some countries, always find the scapegoat and find the next one. And if we don't have the inwards or upwards side, the inward side is to think about my thoughts and my actions. The upwards is fearing God and receiving His message, and we may think about the climate change and COVID-19, how to deal with them, how to know and adjust our three antennas in climate change in this world of ourselves, our nations, or of our class. So the next one, the last one. So we need study from the Teletubbies. We should have three antennas. One is inward, one is outward, one is upward. And if we have the three antennas, we will become a knowledgeable person. The knowledgeable person has the ability to know God and to know people. To know people, to have the knowledgeable and the world recognized. So I think in the climate change, we should have the framework and we know where we are and how to do. Thank you.
And the final discussion will be Suzhou. He is the activist and also farmers in Yunnan New Territories in Hong Kong, China. And he formerly worked for Greenpeace and Hong Kong in India. And he got the PhD degree in cultural studies from Lingnan University. So, Zhao Sizhong, please.
Good afternoon and good morning and good evening, everyone. Thanks, Casey and Jade for having me in this very insightful and important events, and also thanks for all the analysis and perspectives from the speaker. Actually, what I have prepared is something more experience from Hong Kong instead of because I don't really have the framework or those kind of perspective to address the topic, but I'm going to tell you something about Hong Kong, which I think most of the people in the world probably don't know, which is about the agricultural sectors in Hong Kong and what people have been doing and are still doing here. And I'm going to address the problem of why Hong Kong are so underproduced in its agricultural sectors. And well, Hong Kong is one of the highest monetary incomes economies in the world, yet in terms of the vegetable self-sufficiency rate, it stay around 2%, which is 0.02 for more than a decade already. However, historically, the vegetable farmers in Hong Kong are not so unskillful. They are indeed very skillful and very efficient, I would say. Because examples like in the mid-20th century, like in the 1950s and 1960s, farmers in Hong Kong, they actually save and produce seeds originally from mainland China when the country was in social and economic turbulence. And in late 19th century, late 1970s, when the China began her open door policy, Hong Kong farmers actually went back to mainland China and bring along with their management and technical skills there for the development of the Chinese horticultural industry. So and in terms of self-sufficiency rates of vegetable, Hong Kong actually can produce almost half of the vegetables for the city's consumption in the 1970s. So the problem in Hong Kong is not so much about the skills or the productivity of Hong Kong farmers. And let me give you some other figures. And currently, only 10%, 1/10 of the classified farmlands in Hong Kong are under cultivation of vegetables and flowers. In other words, something like 90% of the farmland are just abandoned, left to wild trees and wild grasses. And there are many reasons to this seemingly paradoxical situation of agricultural underproduction, such as the development of real estate and etc. etc. But I'm going to talk about a little. I'm going to talk a little bit about another dimension of this situation, which is the political economy of the Hong Kong agricultural production. To tell this story, we have to know a little bit of history of the vegetable production in Hong Kong. The law regulating marketing of vegetables in Hong Kong actually derived from the wartime control of the transportation and distribution of foodstuff. The law actually vested all the rights and power of vegetable marketing in a semi-governmental organization called VMO. And through the VMO, all locally produced vegetable has to be sold through this semi-governmental organization. And back then, this attempt of centralization by the colonial government was to a significant extent ignored and transgressed by the local vegetable farmers and sellers, because they are just opening up a lot of what we call local dawn markets all over the place instead of going through the government central market. And indeed, despite this incomplete attempt of the colonial government to centralize the vegetable sectors, local vegetable production actually boomed and constituted a solid fraction until, at least the 1980s of the last century. Like 1/3 of the locally consumed vegetables are still locally produced in 1980s. And let's imagine a time not so long ago, the 1980s in Hong Kong. At that time, actually, I was born and grew up at that time. And then at that time, the infrastructure and the technology of transportation, like the national highway system in China, and also the cold chain vehicles, etc., were not so developed. And it was therefore quite impossible for the green leaf vegetable to stand the long distance transportation from the mainland China to Hong Kong. And the result is not so bad, I would say, because we were eating more local foods, and then the size of the local markets was indeed big enough to support local farmers to develop skills and local species that were specific to our niche environments. In another word, at that time, I mean 1980s up until 1980s, Hong Kong were eating more, relatively more seasonally, freshly and environmental friendly. And on the other hand, because of the relatively substantial vegetable production in Hong Kong, it also represents a more just economic return to the farmers. And hence, as a sector, the vegetable production, the sector of vegetable production is also more viable. Of course, I'm comparing with this situation with the low price import vegetables dominating the market now. So, but the situation I mentioned in the 80s began to take on another direction. When the local farmers began to start large-scale vegetable farms in mainland China and ship their produce all the way back into Hong Kong. There was a period when the mainland China was controlling this type of export to Hong Kong by a quota system, because as we know it, even in the open door policy, it still was to a certain extent a socialist economy, so a quota system. But that quota system was indeed receded with the entering of the mainland China into WTO since the mid-1990s, and the result was that the price of vegetable was driven down very, very seriously. Not only did we see the amount of vegetable export from mainland China rocketing to an unprecedented level, the distance travel was also stretched very much. And nowadays, it was just common to eat a dish of green leaf vegetable grown like something like 2,000 kilometers away from Hong Kong. And of course, we have to thank this for the infrastructure, the transportation technology, and also the political economic arrangement. And so most of these vegetables are not marketed through the centralized market I mentioned earlier on. And the governments actually lost their capacity to regulate, or even retreated from regulating the local production altogether. So what I've said above is a very short version of the transformation of the vegetable farming in Hong Kong. And with this in mind, I think we will be more capable of understanding the paradox of agricultural underproduction in the present Hong Kong. I mean, before the 80s, it is easy to imagine that farming was attractive to, attractive for the farmers to stretch the production through increasing the farm size and also the labor. Nowadays, the cost of employing more labor may well not be paid off by the marginal increase of sales, and hence the present and also the market structure. This is the context in which the farms in Hong Kong are not expanding, even if farmers are actually equipped with the skills, and abandoned farmland are just everywhere in sight. And that was about a very something about the agricultural sector in Hong Kong. And I mean, just like a lot of documentary films on food and agriculture, we usually see hopes by the end of the narrative, mostly in the form of grassroots initiative, and Hong Kong is no exception. And historically, the first organic farm in Hong Kong is said to be dated back in the 1970s. And in the 80s and 90s, witnessed the emergence of a range of groups for organic farmers and also environmental concern groups. And they began to advocate for the importance of organic agriculture. And in the recent decades, I mean, in the last 10 years, small-scale organic farms began to scatter in the northern part of Hong Kong. And take our farm as an example. The name of our farm is called Seng Wut Kun. The meaning of it is a place for everyday life. Our farm actually began as an unintended fruit of a protest against the construction of an express rail that led to the demolition of lots of villages 10 years ago. And at that time, we actually instrumentally took farming as a means for organizing and mobilization. We would like to gather more people to stay in the village and against the encroachment of the government official. Yet, with more understanding of the technique and also the philosophy behind permaculture, which is the way of farming that we practice, we begin to realize that farming not only has the potential to mobilize and organize against the express rail, it is indeed essential for the mobilization and organization of a better community and a better future. And also the long process of learning to supply seasonal produce of all sorts is backbreaking but satisfying. And now, after 10 years of learning, we now have a small vegetable garden which supply around a few dozen family and also a couple of small shops. Starting from last 2 or 3 years, we have another field which specializes in paddy cultivation and organize a range of educational activities. And we also organize some annual film, a small-scale film festival annually, and bring documentary films of relevant issues to the public. And what I would like to say is that our farm is indeed very, very small comparing to the scale in most of the world, and the work we are capable of is very, very limited. But our experience told us that even in a tiny space like Hong Kong, with its overwhelming supplies of anti-seasonal vegetables of all sorts, we are not really working alone. And especially having the opportunity to listen from all the speakers, and yeah, I confirm my view again. And thank you very much. And yeah, I'm looking forward for any further discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Chow. He represents the future and also the young generation, which is committed to rural reconstruction in Hong Kong City. Thank you very much. And now it's open to the floor. So any questions or comments, please?
Thank you very much. I mean, I think this has been a really rich discussion altogether, and we've been carrying some of it on in the chat. And so I mean, in response both to the discussants and to the other speakers, I want to start by clarifying one key aspect of what I was wanting to say, is because I'm not saying that the action that we need to be taking economically and in terms of social and socialist transformation didn't need to be global. Of course, it does need to be global, and I think I did in fact say that, and I think I also say it more in my written remarks. But I was specifically critiquing the Yanis Varoufakis notion of then globalizing having a global Green New Deal. and wanting somehow to make that into a centralized, agreed economic approach. Because what I was trying to say is that there are reasons why the Green New Deal originated in the UK and is applicable specifically in the way that it's formulated to the Euro-Atlantic countries, the US, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. These are the ones, and a number of European countries taking it up. And I thought it was very interesting that South Korea too, because in many ways their economy is also very much rooted in that, the capitalist, military industrial kind of economy. Those are the countries that have to have this kind of New Deal that, thinkers like Caroline Lucas and the group that got together in 2008 came up with. Now, that Green New Deal is both about how we in the exploitative countries, if you want to put it that way, need to change our economies. But if you read some of that stuff, and I didn't have time to kind of go into more detail because I'm not an economist, I'm a physicist, in fact, by training. I look at where the evidence is, and in different kinds of ways, perhaps from economists. But what I was trying to say was that the Green New Deal has to start with changing the capitalist economies. Now, part of that change has got to be the kinds of things that Jayati spoke about. And I thought her response was actually fascinating and very good for me too, as were the responses from Mithika and Ashish from their different perspectives. The response that said, of course, we have to also have global initiatives to do that redistribution of resources. So not all countries contributed to the climate destruction, and not all countries have the resources to deal with it. And this was also why I talked about that there is also global south within the countries of the North. Black Lives Matter is about the oppression of Black people who are still, more than 100 years since slavery was, ended in the United States. You see Black and other minoritized communities and women also who suffer disproportionately from all aspects of poverty and disadvantage and discrimination. And this is, in a sense, what I meant by the global South within the global North. And so whatever initiatives we choose economically and socially to make the transformations have to both redistribute from rich to poor globally in terms of nation, and also redistribute that within the economies of our own countries. And I think that's where I was coming from in the kinds of things I was saying, and why I see such hope in the Black Lives Matter and the youth Extinction Rebellion, these sorts of grassroots activist movements, because like we heard kind of from the very last speaker, who was also very interesting on telling us this specific example of how, in resistance to a massive construction for a railway that was destroying farmland, they have come to both build farming in a different way and then also have that interaction with mainland Chinese farmers and others to really rethink how, to bring back more of a kind of localized farming. So that's, these are these connections that I think are brilliant. And the very last point was, and I loved Jayati's critique of the notion of Green New Deal. And actually that was also part of the feminist Green New Deal stuff that I had read And I will put I realized that I wrote right through the night to get the written paper, and then I didn't put all my references in. So this is there. They also talk about a rainbow, reaction or something like this. And I said, well, instead of a Green New Deal, let's have a rainbow resurgent partnership network. Because this is really what we're talking about. And maybe we need to think about how we can come from our diverse backgrounds to write about and talk about how these things interconnect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. And Jayati has an urgent call, so she already left. So the next one will be Mithika, please.
So just a couple of additional comments. I don't think so much in the form of responses, but Rebecca very, very rightly said about the global South in the North. And similarly, in following up on Jayati's comments, we also have a global North in the South. Especially if you look at countries like India and China and so on, there's a maybe 1 to 5% or 5 to 10% of the population that is living the consumerist, extremely wasteful, extremely elitist lifestyles that the North is living. And very heavy consumption patterns, very heavy on the climate. And of course, very heavy on our own internal domestic marginalized sections in terms of the exploitation of resources and so on. So I think this is something that also any kind of new transformation, rainbow transformation, whatever we want to call it, has to deal with. And this is very important because what happens is that the same elites in countries like India take an average and say India is still very low on the on carbon emissions per capita, or India's contribution to the global ecological crisis is still very low per capita, which is true per capita because that's where we're dividing it by 1.3 billion people. But it's what Greenpeace India once said is sort of hiding behind the poor. So the fact that we have 100 million people in India who are actually way exceeding any kind of sustainable levels, and at the same time, therefore, marginalizing other parts of India that do not have that space. And I like that concept very much from, Rita about the concept of space. So the unequal distribution of space. So I think this is something that also we have to look at. And the second, and I think this is a huge challenge for all of us, is how do we reach the hearts and minds of a very large section of ordinary people who are also sold to the same destructive developmental progress kind of model and ideology, and increasingly, unfortunately, also sold to right-wing fascist, neo-fascist kind of regimes. We see that in India, where there is a blind faith in our prime minister. Whatever he says and does, however much he bungles, he still is the hero. And I guess it's the same with so many of the other incredibly fascist right-wing dictators that we have in so-called democracies. And I think one big fault that we've had, not fault, but one big weakness that we've had as human rights or ecological or social movements is that we've been speaking too intellectually. It's too much trying to get to people's minds, whereas they are really good at getting to people's hearts. It's really emotional messaging and things like that. And we haven't done enough of that. We need to be able to tell stories. We need to be able to inspire people through not saying, greening is good for the climate kind of thing, but okay, here's a fantastic story, like the story that Shechong Chow just told us about a few farmers who are, creating a wonderful oasis of organic within Hong Kong and being able to reach consumers who want that. I think it's these stories of inspiration through different media that we need to be able to tell much more if we want to reach people who are otherwise sold to the capitalist dream. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashish. Gustave?
Yeah, thank you. So it was very, very interesting and very exciting. I want to come back to a sentence of Gramsci. He says, old world is dying, new world is not yet coming, and in these periods, we see coming the monsters. And I think that the monsters are here. We can see them in many countries. And the old world is dying. But what is the new world? And I think this new world is here now. And I will give you 5 revolutions which are going on in these times. The first one is the women's rights revolution. It's millenary relationships which are changing. And of course, it's make big resistance. The second one is the ecological revolution, because it is a philosophical revolution. The religion of development have no way now. The third one is, I will say, the second phases of decolonization. The first phases was state independences. It succeeded, but we see the limits of state independency, and we are entering in the phases of people liberation. The fourth one is the revolution of internet, numeric, and biotechnology. And in fact, it's not only a technical and technological revolution. It's a question of the language. And the fifth one is a demographic revolution with the question of scholarization and the question of migrations. So that's why I want to say that we are living the change. It has begun. We don't know how it will pursue, but we can fight for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Gustave. And we noticed that Victor Hugo from Ecuador now is the 4 p.m. in the 4 a.m. in the early morning. So, so you are so committed to listening to South Forum. Do you want to speak something? Say something?
Very important subjects about this evolution in climate justice. It's necessary to understand that in this moment there are many governments that not accept this change. And there are many movements, social movements also, that push very change in this subject. But the more difficult is the imperialist intervention in the monetary international funds and World Bank. The pressure of the monetary fund is very criminal. It's the in situation very hard for the movement social, for communities of indigenous, of peasants in all countries of South America. It's necessary to understand that climate change is a challenge for all people, for all enterprise, private or public. And in this moment, in Ecuador, there are many movements, social movements, that challenge this intromission, this ingerence, economical imperial in the economical situation on my country. It's necessary to understand that the solidarity, international solidarity, is very necessary, and also the exchange of experience. There are many directors, the many dirigents, the many leaders that is necessary to found one form to find one calendar, one date to be one position, common position, fast the struggle of emancipatory situation. Thank you.
And now we still have a free discussion. You can express your idea. So, Rita.
Yeah, this has been really fascinating. Actually, when I was listening to Si Chang Chao, I was also, I cannot help but, really making this comparison between Hong Kong and Singapore. I mean, Singapore in the past used to be an agricultural society before it got into like all these like drive towards development and urbanization and the story it just went on, and it's always now being seen as the sort of like the I don't know, the Switzerland of Southeast Asia, or the GDP per capita is the highest in Southeast Asia. So it's been looked up as sort of like this model of development. Again, I think this adds to the hegemony, right? Of this kind of development actually works to bring prosperity to everybody. But at the same time, again, how much land is actually being allocated for food production? Maybe 1% only, and that's actually very minimal. So while this looks like a very green island, I would say that if you look at Singapore, the green areas is actually pretty fascinating. I mean, it ticks all the boxes in terms of this green urban planning kind of requirements. You see a lot of parks, a lot of nature reserves in Singapore. But at the same time, there is this kind of, like I said, without challenging this global capitalism kind of mode of development, right? We are sort of like facing a contradiction here. And I think, since I was hearing what Si Chang Chao was sharing with us, maybe let me just share like one of the image just to illustrate what what also Ashish was talking about. How do we actually appeal to those who are already sold to this kind of a mode of development, right? This is just a screenshot of this YouTube video about the sort of the contradiction between development and the food crisis, and this is not just about food. Actually, it's the ecological crisis, right? I'm just thinking, just to illustrate what I was saying about difficulty of getting this message across to my students here is that when I take them, this image is from Indonesia, and this is an image about a farmer in Yogyakarta who was fighting to retain the land from being demolished to build a new airport. And then everybody there say that, a new airport is necessary because we need all these tourists to come to the city. Well, not anymore now during the pandemic, but I mean, it's still sort of like something that is sort of like prescriptive. And when I sort of like bring this case up to my students, for example, then they will, oh yeah, they will actually feel it for the farmers, right? Like, yeah, they need to be compensated. But what I'm thinking that how do we actually bring the discussion across that it's not just about the financial compensation for the land, but it's about the whole system. You know, how do we actually place an airport as a priority over a farmland to produce rice for the food security and food sovereignty of the people? And so this kind of thinking really requires another push. And I should say that I still feel that I'm facing a challenge in sort of like conveying this kind of thoughts to students. Again, it's I do believe that probably is we do it step by step, but just to look at this kind of image and sort of like have a different perspectives to whether for people who are, I believe that everybody who is in this webinar will say, you know, this is an example of an injustice. You know, this is disastrous. But then how do we actually have that spread out that kind of critical thinking across? And so I think, you know, in the students in Singapore, in which agriculture has been sort of like almost wiped out for development, right? This kind of image may actually be an image of, you know, the a necessary collateral for progress, which is again is really not in line with what we are discussing right now. So just to illustrate what I was saying just now, just reminded me, Si Cheng Chow really reminded me of this image, you know, when he was sharing about his experience. Thanks.
Mithika, are you ready to
Yes.
speak now? Yeah, please. Yeah, the final round of express your view. Yeah.
So, I think my view, I have two important points to raise on this forum. First and foremost, as a South-South forum, we need to look at the imbalance of representation because South-South, I don't know how it has been done because this is the first one I'm participating in. Is a very good spirit, but we would want to see more Africans, voices of Africa in this forum. I think we have a lot to gain in terms of South-South exchanges, knowledge sharing, and updating each other on the struggles which we go through every time. And that actually is the spirit of climate justice. As I mentioned again, climate justice means broader participation, broader consultations, and listening also to those who are at the front line of this crisis. So that is very important. I'm not saying we do not have crises in the rest of the global south, but I believe disproportionately Africa suffers more than any other region in the world. So we need really to hear our voices in such forums. Number two, we are in a very critical moment, and this is the time we need really each other. We need the solidarity of unprecedented proportions, and the way, despite the challenges which we are experiencing. When I was speaking, I did mention that we have 640 million Africans who are actually facing energy poverty. energy is one of the key enablers of the platforms like this one, which we are using now. Without energy, you cannot be able to do what we are doing here. Without a gadget like a mobile phone or a computer, you cannot be able to use such a platform. Without internet connection, you cannot be able to use such a platform. So in a nutshell, what I'm saying is that you can imagine out of around 1 billion Africans, almost 3/4 are already cut off from the rest of the world because this is the only mode which we can communicate in. I think that myself, I could be having the privilege of having this, what we are doing here. And I'm just asking myself, what do we do now moving forward in the time of the pandemic, addressing climate change and other crises? So what this means is that as we find new ways of doing things, new ways of communication, we should not forget that this will plunge as many people, more people, than what we are experiencing now into deeper crises. And we need really to think about them. So I want again to thank the organizers for inviting me to make this presentation. And I believe that this is just a conversation which continues even beyond the period of this of the forum. Thank you very much.
My response is actually I enjoy a lot the discussion about the North within the South, and also the South within the North, and also the different degree of access to space. I'm going to illustrate this with a photo. Let me see if I can. Yeah, this is indeed our one of our farm who which we grow paddy rice, and what I'm going the reason I said that I enjoy a lot about the discussion about the South in the North and also the North in the South, etc., is because the photo actually is showing some of the activity that we organize in the farm. And indeed, I have some, how to say, complicated feeling to the activity that we organize. Because as you see in the photos, the kids are running around in the paddy field. And I have to admit that the kinds of activity that we hold, that we organize, the participant, the majority of the participants would not be those of the most deprived. They won't. It is quite rare that families or participants from the grassroots economic situation are able to join, not only because of the cost they have to pay to join this activity, but also because it is easy to imagine that working parents rarely have the leisure or the time to take their children or to plan activities for their children. And this is why the reason I always feel complicated about the things that we organize. But yet, even though the family background of our participants are mostly or at least middle class or at least lower middle class, of course, we don't have those elites or powerful people joining our activity. That's what I believe. But looking at the children, looking at all these children playing around and then discovering animals and insects and learning the very basics of planting and etc. makes me feel that it's like we are doing something like sowing seeds, to speak literally, and I will sometimes think that, or have to admit that it is not, it is out of our capacity to like help raising or alleviating the class problem of Hong Kong, and we have to admit that what we are doing is not really able to help the people who suffer from a poverty problem and etc. But then that is one aspect of our work, and what we are able to do is to like connect people, no matter what class are they from, and then to bring them back to work a little bit, even a little bit only on the land, and then try to like sow a seed in their mind or in their memory and then implant some images in their memory too about, oh wow, there is things like that which is fun, which is good, which is healthy, and which is safe in their memory. So they in the future, I don't know what kind of plant and what kind of growth would that seed generate. But I think this is what we try to like articulate, what the meaning or the significance of what we are doing now. Yeah, I think that's my a little more sharing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And all speakers, discussants, and also interpreters. So we finished our section. And within 3 hours, we have the evening sections, the future of humanity and alternatives to capitalism. And we have a dialogue between Gustave Esteva from Earth University, Mexico, and also P. Sinai from India, People's Archive of Rural India. And then we also have 4 discussants, Abrima Sao, Paris Yaros, Margaret, and also Dai Jinghua from Peking University. So welcome you all. Okay, see you within 3 hours. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.